no idea what it's doing. Or maybe it would, and it simply would be screwing it up out of some kind of malice, who knows. Religions appeal to truth. Now, religions either dictate it, like the hardcore Islam, they sort of equivocate on it. In other words, they'll say that this is true, but this other area cannot be known because it's God's mystery, like Christianity. Or they can avoid it entirely and essentially derive their authority based on this idea that it's not necessary. Buddhism sticks out as that because you never really understand why things are the way they are in Buddhism. It simply is that way, now pursue it. Non-religion, meanwhile, it really loses traction here. You see, when you remove things like natural law, religion, ethics, things like that, the systems that these people try to come up with are not relying on ordained truth. They're relying on a communal truth, whether or not it's scientific knowledge or just some common consensus of what should be or ought to be. But then that inevitably devolves into two problems. One is that you don't know whether or not that scientific truth is actual truth, and of course it doesn't encompass enough. You know, science is only taking us so far. It's not answering a lot of social questions to any significant consensus. And then you've got the ethical problems. You've got the people saying, well, we need to have such and such a system to provide clean water to such and such people. Well, you have to question why those people. Why do they deserve it? Why do other people don't? Why are you funding this and you're not funding that? Questions devolve into utilitarianism, but based on whose standards? Because utilitarianism requires some kind of focal point. You know, what objective are you going for? Based on what? Using what information? Well, if your information isn't perfect, if you're not relying on some kind of information, then what do? One of the big things which has resulted from this is this recent succumbing to normative moral relativism, where we simply have to tolerate what other people do so long as they don't kill us. But even then, they can just kill you slowly. Now, what I've noticed is that all of these systems, these philosophies, these religions, these governments, these ethical codes, the Bill of Rights, the UN Convention on Human Rights, all of these things, they either don't appeal to an absolute truth and have some kind of consensus which can never be reached, or they dictate a communal truth as absolute, especially religion. It will say, this is what there is nothing else to see, act accordingly. I've noticed that none of these systems ever acknowledge that these truths are communal. They never acknowledge that their knowledge is imperfect. And they never seek perfect knowledge. They derive their authority from something either that can never be attained, aka consensus, so long as people are individuals, or on something which is already known, therefore that's where the authority derives. Because if it's known, then you work on it and it's rational. They never acknowledge that that might not be true. That is only what we can see within our narrow little viewpoint, or within the narrow viewpoint of a community. They never place at their apex the desire to seek absolute truth. Now, the objective of my life, and the objective of others, whether or not they realize it or not, is either one of two things. Either you completely devolve into hedonistic pursuits to live life up, whatever that means, to whatever ends of pleasure or pain you want, whatever, or you seek truth. An awful lot of people stop that search the moment they find religion, or they change to another religion and they say that that's the real religion. But ultimately they're seeking truth. It's not too difficult to take a rational person and to poke holes in whatever faith they have, and then they'll say, well, I just rely on faith. But that means that you don't know the truth. So, that is what it is. So, if my objective is to find truth, to seek truth, then I've got to avoid these conventions which dictate truth or rely on some kind of consensus which can never be reached. They don't work. It occurred to me that setting up a system specifically based on seeking truth while acknowledging that communal truth is relative to a community, so long as that community is always willing to revise what it knows, that would be a much more efficient system of social cohesion. Essentially, the state religion is that. It has a lot of conflicts, obviously, which I'll get into in a minute, but it seems viable from where I stand. Now, you got many problems. Is absolute truth knowable? Do we have the means as humans, or as transhumans, or as whatever humans will evolve into? Do we have the means to know truth? Can truth be computed? Does it simply require a lot of people thinking? Or is truth something beyond that? Is there a way to comprehend the universe, or is the universe incomprehensible? Are there multiverses? Is there infinity to the universe such that we will never encompass it all? All excellent questions. Now, the problem is that all of those questions stop short of actually providing a working framework for building a society, for moving forward. Because if we sit here and get caught up in all of those, we'll never progress anywhere. So, in order to move somewhere, we need to have some kind of base assumptions to work with. And that does a lot to damage this, I know. But it's better than not even starting the race in the first place. So, the assumption is that we need to have a community which focuses on its own betterment, the advance of technology, and the appropriate conditioning of just the group psychology to be more philosophically minded rather than simply just growing and just increasing the standard of living, being hedonistic and being on the heroin drip, because those will never go anywhere. See, on the one hand, asking questions which cannot be answered right now is like not starting the race. To simply succumb to hedonism is to give the race up entirely, so at least there's a motive to begin. But it still gets us nowhere. Hedonism is even worse. It guarantees that we will never go anywhere. There's not even the motive. So, what conditions specifically are we talking about which would encourage the seeking of absolute truth? Well, first we need a society which is rational. It values rationality. Irrationality is delusion. You're expecting wrong outcomes. That has nothing to do with truth. It's based on false truths, if anything. It's relying on absolutes which are not there. So delusion must be avoided. This includes feelings. This includes the idea that you shouldn't hurt someone's feelings. It gets in the way of truth. Even our instincts. Sometimes instincts are based on good reasons, sometimes they're not. They have to be verified rationally. Second is an ethical framework which promotes life, liberty, and philosophy. We need conditions which elevate humanity to a point where even its lowliest member is encouraged to be a thinker, someone who seeks truth, as opposed to a hedonist. Now, this implies a very strong appeal to some kind of dogma. and that's the caveat, you have to do this without falling into religious delusion. You have to have a system which is compelling enough to encourage people to abide by it, but at the same time does not actually have the absolute truth, which can be used as the basis for authority. It's kind of like putting the cart before the horse. But if we acknowledge that communal truth is insufficient, then we have no choice but to seek it. Seek absolute truth. Now, there is a middle ground here. There's few religions I'm aware of which claim to know things like the complete will of God, or they claim to know complete truth. Christianity, Buddhism, so long as they don't absolutely define everything in no uncertain terms, there's room for a consensus that certain things are unknown and therefore those things are worth figuring out, so long as they don't take that trip which says, oh, well, we'll never know, so there's no point in asking. That has to be avoided. So it's a very sticky business overall. And last is, we need a society which discourages lies. Now that in of itself is probably the core ethical, if you want to call it that, tenet, which not only is absolutely necessary, but is also incredibly difficult to enforce, if not impossible. Again, there's that idea of pain versus pleasure. There's the idea of what is more important, what is actually valued. Expediency, a weapon, a tool to be used against people, or do we value truth? I mean, it's possible to brainwash people into following this. It's possible to remove individuality and create a hive mind, which just pretty much creates one big computer. But what good does that do, and where does it leave us? Is not free thinking, new avenues, new approaches, new possibilities, free-form evolution, is that not more beneficial than simply turning us into a computer? If we can do it via that means, why don't we just build a massive supercomputer using at some level of technology? But of course, if you notice, all of those answers depend upon humanity advancing in ways which are, at the very least, applicable to this goal. Things which are not necessarily scientific advancements, but social advancements. Things which enable this. Again, this isn't just an effort in being fruitful and multiplying. That's not going to cut it. We can be fruitful and multiply until we fill the entire infinite universe with bodies stacked on top of each other. But that's not going to get us anywhere. So, basically this idea of absolute truth is predicated on the idea that we can get closer to it by combining the merits of individuals who value truth above pleasure and pain, who see some kind of greater picture than their own little existence. But even if this isn't possible, even if humanity was to advance to the point where we can create supercomputers the size of the universe, which can calculate millions of universes, and we're all living in our own made matrices, regardless, this system, this appeal to truth, it would create a society which at the very least would be a hell of a lot less violent, depending on the ethical methods and things which would create this environment. It would be a hell of a lot less delusional, obviously, because the entire idea is to root out delusion, not to embrace it. It would give us an immense amount of purpose, since a lot of people seek purpose, and up until now we've always tried to define it on our own terms. But if we can at the very least create an overall purposeful goal, kind of like a company with a mission statement. So in this sense, it's a